I want to thank my friends and supporters all over the United States and the world for their kind interest in my condition. As you know, I just turned 80 years old and recovered from colon cancer, and I had some minor strokes. And because of this, a group, including some of my relatives, were going to keep me in extended care, they called it, for the rest of my life. This was the same fate which my mentor, Ezra Pound, suffered. He was committed to St. Elizabeth's Federal Institution for the Insane in Washington, D.C. in 1945. And they kept him 13 and a half years without trial until I met a congressman from North Dakota, Usher Burdick, and I interested him in Ezra Pound's situation. He went on the floor of Congress and asked, why is the government holding this man? And the government had no answer. So they released him, dropped all charges after 13 and a half years, and he walked out a free man. So this is what opposition will do. The communist opposition is always very vulnerable. They're usually sexual degenerates, they're into drugs, and they can never openly talk about what they're actually doing. So consequently, I've spent much of my life openly talking about what they're doing, just to inform the American people. Now I wanted to say about my situation that when I was put into these nursing homes, I, for the first time, saw what Ezra Pound had had to endure for 13 and a half years. And I was told that I would never be released from these nursing homes after my strokes. So it was a very grim situation. But I got two of my young nephews. I hired a lawyer, and they revoked the power of attorney they were holding me on, and I was back home here. It was God's miracle, because I didn't think I would ever see it again. I was openly told by the people who had locked me up, you will never set foot in your home again. And it looked that way, because that's the way things are done. But here I am, working harder than ever, and I've launched, I'm republishing 6 of my books, which are out of print. I'm working on a biography of H.L. Hunt. I was a protege of his, and George Sylvester Viereck, and Senator Joe McCarthy. These are biographies which I have to write. I have to tell the American people their true story, because they know little or nothing about what they actually did and why they did it. So I have this tremendous job to do, and I want to thank people who have supported me and helped me get through the most difficult period of my life. I feel as though my career is just starting, because I'm starting all over again, and things are going very well. I'll get these books printed, and I'm doing a 4-volume autobiography, which people have been urging me to do for many years, because it will tell the true story of people like Senator Joseph McCarthy, H.L. Hunt, and I later worked for H.L. Hunt in Dallas after McCarthy passed away. And H.L. Hunt, who was then the richest man in the world, had built a beautiful apartment on the ground floor of his mansion in Dallas, where Joe could stay when he was in Dallas. And when H.L. Hunt later hired me to help him write a couple of books, he moved me into the McCarthy apartment, and I lived there for 2 months. It was very strange, sleeping in Joe McCarthy's bed, and after all these years. But it's just one of the remarkable paradoxes of my life that I seem to wind up in these situations. So the Joe McCarthy story, the H.L. Hunt story, and the George Sylvester Viereck story are the stories of American heroes who devoted their life to this republic and to our history and our people. And in Joe McCarthy's last years, I was at a sort of farewell meeting for him in Washington, D.C., and the people sang a song. They sang, "Nobody's for McCarthy but the people." And this was the situation. The elitists all hated McCarthy. They were elitists in government and elitists in the media, elitists in the schools. They all hated Senator Joseph McCarthy. And Joe McCarthy, after he passed away, they started a campaign to convince the American people he was an evil monster who destroyed people's lives carelessly and through vicious means. And I was at a meeting of the McCarthy Memorial Committee in Appleton, Wisconsin 2 years ago, and his former secretary, Larry Lentz, came up to me, and she said, "Eustace, you know that Joe was always a pussycat." I said, "Certainly I knew that. He was one of the kindest people, most gentle people, and the most sensitive people. He would do anything to avoid hurting anyone's feelings. And this is the man who's portrayed daily in our media as an evil monster who was out to destroy everybody because of his unwarranted hatred of communism." And so this is where we are today. And as I say, Joe's wife, after he died, married someone else. Her daughter changed her name. They could not stand this tremendous outpouring of hatred artificially fueled by the media against the late Joe McCarthy. And the reason for that I explained in a meeting in Appleton, Wisconsin several years ago, the McCarthy Memorial Committee, which I address every year in Appleton. And I said, we're here to honor Senator Joseph McCarthy because this man saved Western civilization from communism. At that time, the United States was the most powerful country in the world, and that power had been enlisted by the communists in Washington in favor of communism. So the only power that communism had was not the power of Stalin's government in Washington, in Moscow, but the power of the democratic administrations in Washington. So people like Felix Frankfurter and the Harold Weir Sale, Alger Hiss, these were the powers behind communism. Joe Stalin was a figurehead. He was hated in his own country because he killed 1 million people a year of Russian people for 70 years. That's 70 million people. He murdered 1 million Russians a year, mostly Christians, because as a communist, he felt that was the only way he could rule. And it was true. The communist government in Moscow was an alien occupying force. It was never Russian. It was not even Bolshevik, but it was communist. And when young Joseph McCarthy came to Washington as a freshman senator, having defeated Senator Robert La Follette, who was totally out of touch with reality, and the people of Wisconsin gladly elected Joe McCarthy to the Senate because it was a new, young, enthusiastic person who was on the right track. He understood communism. And when he later hired me as a private researcher, I opened his eyes for the first time to the reality behind communism. The world banking elite was communist. And they had put up all the money for world communism, and then they had taken over the Washington government, which put the American taxpayers behind communism. Communism was supported almost entirely since 1917 by the American taxpayer. It was started by President Woodrow Wilson when Congress voted him a $100 million special war fund to prosecute World War I. And the new Bolshevik Revolution was in dire straits in Russia, so he sent Secretary of State Elihu Root with $10 million of his personal war fund. He took $10 million to Moscow and bailed out the Bolshevik government. You won't find that in many history books. It's in my books because it's all a matter of record. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was a protege of President Woodrow Wilson. He was Wilson's Assistant Secretary of War in 1917. and he became a protege of Colonel House, who was President Woodrow Wilson's actual manager throughout his 2 campaigns. So Franklin D. Roosevelt inherited Colonel House from Woodrow Wilson, and he inherited the whole propaganda machine behind Colonel House. And that was the political strength of Roosevelt. Originally because he was chosen by Bella Moskowitz. She died suddenly before he was inaugurated. Someone pushed her down the stairs and she broke her neck. And so when Roosevelt was inaugurated as president, he was missing the person who put him there. But he had in his right hand Felix Frankfurter, whom he later appointed to the Supreme Court. Felix Frankfurter was managing the entire Roosevelt administration, and his assistant was Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss, you recall, created the United Nations at the end of World War II in 1945 in San Francisco. And he drafted the United Nations Charter, and he presided over the adoption of the United Nations, which was never the United Nations, it was the Communist Nations, because Alger Hiss was a KGB agent for many years, and he presided over organizing the United Nations as the Communist Nations. And so young Joseph McCarthy came to Washington, and he fell into the hands of 3 people because he was a newcomer. He didn't know his way around. So 3 people took him over as soon as he arrived in Washington. They were George Sokolsky, who was a Bukharinist communist from Russia, who was in the country illegally, and J. Edgar Hoover, who of course was a well-known homosexual in Washington, and Father Walsh of Georgetown University, who these 3 men set up Joe McCarthy's anti-communist campaign. They originated, they pushed him forward, but they pushed him the way they wanted to go. He was only allowed to attack insignificant communists, never prominent communists like the members of the Harold Ware Cell or the Alger Hiss or Felix Frankfurter. They were attacked little Jewish tailors in Brooklyn, New York as dangerous communists. And of course that was all a farce. And so I came along a year or so later. I was recommended to Joe, and I did a special 25-page report, confidential report, on the origins of world communism, explaining where they got their money, how they were organized, and how they operated since 1848 under Karl Marx. So this really opened Joe's eyes, and he took this 25-page speech and he went to Chicago for a special speech before the Union League Club, a very powerful and wealthy group in Chicago, which was run by J.J. Kavanaugh, whom I later worked for in Chicago as president of the Chicago Motor Club. And so J.J. Kavanaugh heard Joe McCarthy, and he was set on fire by this revelation of the origins of communism. And so overnight, this was behind Joe's battle against communism. It wasn't his reading lists of names in West Virginia of alleged communists. Well, they were communists, but they were insignificant people. Not one name on those lists that Joe McCarthy read off, which were prepared for him by J. Edgar Hoover and George Sokolsky, are remembered today. They were non-entities, but that's the way they wanted Joe McCarthy to fight communism. But after I showed him the origins of world communism, then he was on the right track, and he became enormously popular throughout the United States. At that moment, Joe McCarthy was the most powerful politician in the United States.
Hold it there.
Now, I referred to Bella Moskowitz as the architect of Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidential campaign. She was the leading force in New York politics because she had a unique coalition behind her, which made her very powerful and more powerful than anyone else. She was